I'm Park Howell, and welcome to the Business of Story, where I consult, teach, coach, and speak on the applied science and bewitchery of brand and business storytelling, so that you can clarify your story to amplify your impact and simplify your life.
I thought it was just a stupid picture of a pig in the ocean. But after hearing that story, I had to have it. Now I wasn't just buying a picture. I was buying a story. Story literally made the picture worth more money to me.
That's what businesses are about. People buy brands. People buy stories much more than anything else.
I work with a lot of big enterprise companies, but let's just say I always tell folks, drop the PowerPoint, close your laptops, start with your story.
If you want people to get engaged and you want people to act, you have to tell them an emotionally powerful story. That's with great characters, it's with uncertain outcomes, and it's with high stakes and drama.
All business strategy is a story.
The headline of the May 7th article in Political Magazine shouted, "Climate change suddenly matters in the 2020 race. Are the candidates ready?" Yet, our current administration and many in leadership are climate deniers, arguing that the science is faulty. Trump even proclaimed that China is behind the climate hoax. Add to this stalemate that most Americans believe we're more divided as a country than at any other time, and it would seem there's no way to curb a climate catastrophe. But I think we can, just not the way we're currently going about it. I do believe we are impacting our climate, causing our environment to heat up. But I think spewing alarming science is not what's going to get people to move on reducing carbon emissions. Through my storytelling work with Arizona State University's Executive Masters of Sustainability Leadership, I've witnessed audiences being moved by emotion, by stories, drama, not data. But not just there. I now sit as a professional advisor for Walgreens' corporate social responsibility team. They have great stories to tell about the positive impact they're making, but these initiatives are often lost in the numbers, and it can be difficult to get even their internal teams to set aside status quo thinking and buy into a new approach to sustainability. This afternoon, I'm being sworn in by Phoenix Mayor Kate Gallego to serve on her Environment and Sustainability Commission, and I can anticipate the challenges and opportunities ahead. The challenges of finding common ground with a decidedly conservative state on the state of the environment, climate change, and sustainability in Arizona. And I can see the opportunities to make a real impact, as we have with our Water Use It Wisely conservation campaign that has real impact over the past 20 years here. That's why today I am so excited and honored to have two of the most brilliant minds on the business of story to explore how you can effectively connect with a divisive audience and share your compelling point of view to hopefully get them to buy in. Graff and Cathy Birkenstein co-authored They Say, I Say, The Moves That Matter in Academic Writing, which is now in its 4th edition and has sold, get this, over 2 million copies. Jerry is a professor of English and education at the University of Illinois at Chicago and 2008 president of the Modern Language Association of America. He has had a major impact on teachers through such books as Professing Literature and Institutional History, Beyond the Culture Wars. He has had a major impact on teachers through such books as Professing Literature and Institutional History, Beyond the Culture Wars, How Teaching the Conflicts Can Revitalize American Education, and most recently, Clueless in Academia, How Schooling Obscures the Life of the Mind. Cathy Birkenstein, who first developed the templates used in They Say, I Say, is a lecturer in English at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She received her PhD in American literature and is currently working on a study of Booker T. Washington. Together, Jerry and Cathy teach courses in composition and they conduct campus workshops on writing. Now, while their work is about helping students become more compelling academic writers, effectively expressing their arguments in a paper, I think their book, They Say, I Say, is a wonderful manual for anyone in business who is trying to find common ground with an opposing audience, to find a meeting of the minds and a way forward together for the collective good. If you're a writer or really a communicator of any kind for that matter, this show, their wisdom, and the templates or strategic writing moves, as they call them, you'll find in their book is for you. So let's dive in. Welcome to the show, Cathy and Jerry. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I have just really, really enjoyed reading your book, and I had to laugh at the email, your response to my email I sent you the other day, Jerry. And my email said, really enjoying your book. My wife, Michelle, rolled her eyes, suggesting I didn't need any more help winning arguments. And you wrote back, you said, glad you're enjoying the book, and you can reassure Michelle that we're less about winning than bonding. And I thought that was wonderful. And that's what I want to talk about on today's show. Number one, why you wrote the book in the first place and how you are helping our graduates become better communicators through their life and times in college using your templates in They Say, I Say, and how we in the business world, when we are working on any sort of divisive topic and having to communicate around that, whether it's climate change or diversity and inclusion or whatever, how we can apply what you have learned and what you teach to our own world so that we can find common ground and move together as a collective, for the collective good of everyone. So great to have you here.
Thank you. I guess a big motivation for writing our book was our sense that there's a lot of confusion among our students about how to write. And some of it certainly understandable in view of how complicated writing can be and how frustrating it can be. But we had noticed in our own struggles to write that successful writers all seem to be doing a couple of very simple things. And we noticed in our own writing that the more we tried to do these simple things, the more successful we got. And that was simply listen to the conversation that was going on around the subject, often the published conversation, and or the debates about the subject, like climate change would be a good example, sustainability and so forth. Listen to that conversation and then summarize it, figure out how to give a recognizable summary of it to readers, and then use your summary of the conversation to set up your own argument. These steps seemed simple enough that they could even be reduced to a kind of formula, which gave us the title of our book, They Say, I Say. Summarize what they are saying in the conversation around you, and then use that summary of others to create a kind of opening for yourself, kind of launching pad for yourself. And as we discussed this topic more, we realized that it could provide the germ of a book, and that's what generated our book. But we agree with you that we certainly like to think that the book has application beyond academia and to people who are not teachers or students.
Well, and in the article that you sent me in the Critical Reader, Cathy, you guys talk about defining this as dialogical argumentative model. Can you explain that for us?
Well, I think to explain it, it might be nice to go back to your wife's comment that you didn't need any more help winning arguments. Mm-hmm. I think her perception there is very accurate. I think what she's picking up is that when we talk about argumentative writing, which is what most people, if there is any one common view about what is done in academia, it's probably that argumentative writing is academic writing and intellectual civic writing is an argument. You want to persuade people of what your opinion is. You want to win them over to your side. And there's a sort of antagonism in there. There can be a tension there. There's the other people's side, and then there's your side, and you're trying to win and persuade people to adopt your side, people who don't hold your view. And there's a kind of aggression there. And I think your wife was picking that up, that we all get into arguments and we can feel alienated from the people we're arguing with or against. I think what Jerry and I are trying to do with the term argument is build on it and say that, yes, making arguments is incredibly important. Persuading people to adopt your viewpoint and to see your viewpoint is incredibly important. But it isn't necessarily antagonistic automatically, and it doesn't need to necessarily alienate the other side. In fact, our big argument, and another way of redescribing what Jerry said, the one big point is that all effective writers do, is that instead of just coming out with their position and just asserting it and trying to shove it down everybody else's throats, They begin with the counter view. They begin with the worst thing that people can say against their argument, and they summarize it, and then they launch their argument as a response to that counter argument. In other words, they don't bury the other side, and they don't repress it, and they don't try to scapegoat it and railroad it. They really try to understand it, listen to it, perform a kind of meeting of minds in a way, and still assert their own opinion, even a very strong opinion, in response or as a critique to that position that's being summarized. But it involves bringing in the other side. It involves a kind of connecting with the other side, finding common ground, as you kept putting it in your introduction. And I think our use of the term dialogical argument is a sort of, it's not a very pretty word. It's not very elegant. I think we both wish we had a better word for it. Sometimes we call it conversational argument. What we mean to do is we mean to recuperate the notion of argument as a way of engaging in dialogue or conversation with other people, not just shoving your view down their throat.
Mm-hmm. So it's really about conversation where you are bringing people in and finding that common ground, and your templates help you do that. I know your book is primarily about writing, but I feel like you can use these templates not only in writing, but any sort of debate, if you will, or argument or conversation when you're trying to get people to see something your way, whether they're going to buy into it or not. Maybe doesn't matter at first, but you're just trying to get them to appreciate and understand your position on something. Is that right?
Yeah, very much, very much so. And that may seem kind of obvious, but in fact, and a lot of people have been pointing this out, Americans generally have not been very good at the give and take of argument. We're kind of an individualistic culture, and we easily tend to surround ourselves with like-minded people and talk only to others who think the same way we do, so that when we encounter starkly opposing views, and I think the whole climate change sustainability issue is an example that jumps out at you. It's very frustrating when we see people simply denying what seems to be the very obvious and unchallengeable, undebatable, uncontroversial premise that human made climate change is real and is a tremendous threat. Certainly, we all know people, and we're tempted to believe this ourselves. Those of us who believe that it is a threat and that it is real, we're inclined to think that anybody who disputes that, much less thinks that it's a myth or a hoax, must themselves be crazy or evil or totally ignorant. And it's difficult for us to get out. The problem with that mindset, I mean, we can go on thinking that way, but the problem is if we hope to convince these skeptics, we need to be able to reconstruct their view, and in a way that actually enables them to feel that they're being taken seriously. Just to give a brief example of that, I notice in following these debates in the newspapers or in journals that some deniers of climate change don't in fact deny that the phenomenon exists. They claim that it would be too expensive, or it would be ruinous to the economy to adopt certain protections against pollution, or to adopt certain environmental policies. And again, I would probably strongly disagree with that, but it's not a contemptible position, it would seem to me, that there's a cost-benefit analysis that needs to be done. One hopes that in the long run, it turns out that sound environmental policies would be much cheaper in the long run. Alternative fuels, alternative energy, and so forth. But, there's, again, the more I think we acknowledge that there might be a real debate there, the better chance we might have of converting the unconverted.
So, Jerry, would an example of that, kind of a role play, is if you come across someone, they said, you're crazy. If we try to do this, it's going to ruin our economy. We just don't have the means to make that happen. And, we've got a great economy right now. Why would we want to mess with it? Then one argument you might say is, I understand and I totally, appreciate the costs associated with making this change. But if we just looked at what we did in the 1960s, that we are now celebrating putting that first man on the moon 50 years later to the tune of the Apollo program of about $25 billion by putting us on a lifeless rock out there, but all of the technology and the industry and the jobs that were created and the science that was created and proved out in that pursuit. One might argue that we're going to have those same sorts of benefits when we're trying to protect this one and only rock that we know of, that we live on, and that can sustain life, but we'll only do it if we change our ways.
Well, it's an interesting argument, Park. And in fact, I didn't know that about the moonshot. I didn't know that it actually had turned out to, I guess you're suggesting, had paid for itself economically. If someone had told me that it actually was a waste of money or it hadn't paid for itself.
Yeah, with all the industries, computers.
I think that another example would be, I don't know if you would agree with this, but like World War II, people thought, oh, well, that will be an expenditure of money for us to get involved in the war. It actually stimulated the economy. But I think that one thing that that your response to what you just said to Jerry suggests is that your argument that you make is actually going to change depending on the counter argument you're responding to. You're responding to climate deniers who simply believe who simply believe the science is, the science isn't there, or that the science is a hoax. You'll want to craft one type of response. If you're responding to people who have economic concerns, you'll have a different type of response. And that you're always kind of responding, hugging up is one way we put it, hugging up as closely as possible to the counter view, rather than just, as you put it in your introduction, just spewing data and evidence at the other side as if that's going to convince them. I think you have to really listen to the other side and build your argument from what they're saying.
Cathy, to your point then, with the templates that you have put together and they say, I say, can you walk us through a couple of those and how someone might be thinking about this? Because I think what I at least have gotten from your book is it really takes a major mental shift in the argumenteur to go in and say, take a deep breath, be quiet, listen, understand where your opponent, if they are your opponent, are coming from before you actually can start casting your own opinion and your own argument. Your templates allow us to do that. So can you share a couple of those with us?
The central template that we have is the They Say, I Say template that gives our book its title, as Jerry already mentioned. And it's basically a format, a kind of fill-in-the-blank format, a kind of Mad Libs scaffolding, if you will, where students can structure their own content into this form or this formula. Although most people believe blank, blah, 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 I argue blank or blah, blah, blah. It is often said that da-da-da-da-da about sustainability, but in fact, this is the case about sustainability, and I'll explain it to you. And then we have a sort of a more elaborated template. We call it the template of templates, which really gives the structure for an entire essay or an entire book or an entire lecture. And it goes something like this. I'll read it. I hope it's comprehensible to your audience. In recent discussions of blank, a controversial issue has been whether blank. On the one hand, some argue that blank. From this perspective, blank. On the other hand, however, others have argued blank. In the words of blank, one of this view's main proponents, and then you can include a quote or quotation. According to this view, blank. In some, then, the issue is whether or not blank or blank. And then the next paragraph begins, my own view is that blank. Though I concede that da-da-da blank, I still maintain blank. For example, here's your evidence. You can maintain your evidence. Although some might object that blank, that's for entertaining a counter argument to your position, I would reply that blank. This issue is important because. I'm sure a lot of your listeners out there have been using a lot of this language in their own speaking and in their own writing, and that they probably recognize it from the readings that they've done, summarize a debate and then take a position in that debate, or summarize a position and then respond to it, agree with it, disagree with it, some combination of both. But we're trying to kind of formalize this language and give it to students and people who want help with their writing and lecturing, give them sort of a more immediate type of help with this kind of, we call it argue speak, the language of argumentation.
It's funny, as soon as you say argumentation, my brain all of a sudden fires up like, all right, we're in an argument, but you're not really. That's kind of the holding term. You're really talking about a conversation that is at odds. Two parties are at odds, and they're just trying to suss out what might be the truth in all of this.
Yeah, I don't think, though, that one should shy away from the term argument or debate or disagreement. I mean, there are arguments built into any stories, or at least any story that has a point makes a kind of argument. And I mean, the term argument can be used in a neutral way. Doesn't mean fighting, or it doesn't mean putting somebody down. It just means you're advancing a proposition, you're advancing a claim. But the term argument also, as you just pointed out, has a kind of combative, even pugilistic connotations. And while it's true, as we were saying before, that we don't feel that in our own work we're about promoting pugilism or confrontation or combat, there are moments when you do want to win. You want to drive the rascals out, and you want your policy to succeed over the opposing policy. So,
but you do that best not by ignoring or evading or caricaturing your opponent. You actually persuade them best by connecting with them on what they believe in already, what their ideally their counter view is to you, right. On their terms.
On their terms, yeah, on their view of the world, absolutely.
You can actually be more successful in getting people over to your side with this kind of approach, we think.
No, on the issue of climate change, going back to this question of how you would win over skeptics who think it's a hoax, or think that that environmentalists are barking up the wrong tree. It's occurred to me, and this has come up in connection with President Trump recently. He's apparently sent out some tweets that use the weather patterns, the fact that there's cold weather in May or early June, as if that refuted the idea of global warming. How could we be having, if it's global warming, why is it so cold in June? Again, this may seem laughable from any kind of scientific point of view. I suppose it is laughable. However, it does have a kind of intuitive persuasiveness. I wondered myself, and I've only recently seen explanations of this. I've seen it said that global warming, unleashes cold air from the polar regions by eroding a certain film or membrane in the polar regions. I don't know if that's true or not, but I mean, I'm bringing this up because even though pro-environment people would laugh off as absurd the confusion between the daily weather and the climate, that we say, well, they're confusing the climate with weather. That's an elementary mistake or an ignorant mistake. This hasn't been explained clearly at all. There was that movie a while back, about the end of the world, The Day After Tomorrow or something like that. It depicted a universe that was not sweltering in heat, but that was encased in ice. And I don't even remember that film explained how it was that global warming produces extreme cold temperatures. So I don't think this has been explained clearly at all, and therefore I don't think that it's fair to sneer or laugh at people infer that because there's a cold stretch in June, that therefore global warming has been refuted. So I mean, this would be one example of how we might start taking more seriously our fellow citizens who have beliefs that we think are superstition.
Yeah. And one way I look at that, Jerry, because I hear you too, it seems to fly in the face of science. If we're warming up, why do we have these cool snaps? And I can tell you here in Phoenix, we had an absolutely beautiful spring, and May and June have been cooler than usual. So one might argue, what in the world's going on? The way I think about it, very simplistic terms in my own way, is when you are sick, when you have the flu, and your body, your metabolism is a little bit out of whack. That's, people are arguing that this is what we are doing to our climate, that you get spikes, you get a fever, right? But what do you also get? You get the chills. You go just the opposite direction, and you feel both of those. One, I guess you could argue in very simplistic terms that, well, this is just kind of mimicking what happens to our own biome when we are not balanced and, we've got the flu, we've got something going on. We experience all of this. We don't feel normal. We don't feel good. And that's what we are seeing with these flux in weather patterns. I'm no weather scientist, but that's just a simple way of thinking about it. But let's get back to the template. So, Cathy, when you walked us through that one, and I'm just going through and yep, that makes sense. And what I saw in your book says makes sense. But I would imagine people push back and say, they're too simple. They're too reductive. It can't possibly work. You're taking away my creativity. Let me just be me and write. How do you counter that or help them see the light in? Because it must be working. Otherwise, you wouldn't be selling 2 million plus books.
One way we address that counter view is to treat it as a legitimate counter view, the skepticism against our templates. We try and incorporate that into our textbook and summarize it and answer it ourselves. And one of the ways that and we do this in our classrooms as well, we don't just give the students the templates and expect them to run with them and incorporate the templates in their writing. We debate with students whether the templates are in fact something that stifles creativity, stifles originality. And it's a really good debate and actually ends up opening up with our students almost invariably. And somebody will say, well, hold on, wait, what is creativity? Doesn't creativity have set forms, set formats, set formula, set rules? That improvisation, even in a given artistic genre, is based not so much on not knowing the forms of that genre, but on improvising on them and tailoring them to one's own needs. So creativity for us is not the rejection of set formats or formula like our templates, but so building on them and using them for creative ends. Furthermore, our templates don't dictate what a student says, and this is something that we debate and discuss with our class. They dictate the form or the frame in which they say what they want to say. So students can make any argument they want under the sun. It can be conservative, it can be liberal, it can be libertarian, it can be any given methodology they want, academic methodology. But the form is pretty much as we say, the internal DNA of academic intellectual thinking. So our first assignment with our students is to allow them to use the templates to take a position on the templates, summarize a counter view, and if they don't want to use the templates at all, they can come up with some alternate form, but they have to thematize why that form is superior to our templates.
Yeah, another thing that we say when somebody says that we are too simple or simplistic, we're reductive, we're formulaic, or we're promoting formulaic writing, we point out that that criticism itself uses formulas. I think let me back up on this point, that I think there's a lot of confusion about language and, as Cathy was saying, originality and in our culture. If you think about it, a huge proportion of what we say in our communication is a set of formulas, is based on formulas, right from hello, how are you, to the structure of our sentences. I mean, we couldn't communicate at all if it weren't for formulas. If we went back over this conversation that we've been having in this podcast, you'd notice that a good deal of it consists of formulas. I just used one just now. If we were to go over this conversation in this podcast, or you could say in this whatever, in this cocktail party or something, like that, we're constantly plugging in, filling in the blanks in communication to structures that pre-existed the conversation and that pre-existed us. That we didn't invent phrases like "hello, how are you?" or "in this conversation, I want to say this" rather than that. Those are prescripted formulas. I'm trying to say that the vast amount of language is prescripted. Learning, if it weren't prescripted, we would never learn how to speak. We would never learn how to converse. It would be, if every utterance were original, it would be we would be incomprehensible to each other.
That's what language is. Language is a set of agreed upon conventions and scripts and pre-existing symbols that we all agree have certain meanings and how to use them.
Originality and creativity consist of what we do within that prescripted set of structures. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about this. Cathy and I published an article years ago in the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is, I think, still available online, called "Formulaic is not a four-letter word." The word formulaic, and this is true of a lot of academics, even writing specialists, use the word formulaic as a derogatory term. Oh, you're being formulaic. But formulas, as we've been saying, are given. Now, it's certainly true that there is a certain kind of writing that is formulaic in the bad sense, that uses cliches and that says things that are
pedantic, banal.
Yeah, banal,
predictable,
or
stereotypical.
Yeah,
that's a content problem.
That's a content problem.
So what you're saying is, as we're born and we're brought up, learn our language, we innately know these formulas, so we're not thinking about them. But when we get to college, we need to be more intentional about how we are stating our arguments and how we're going about that in our writing, which also then makes us internalize how we are dealing with that audience sitting across from us.
There are special kinds of formulas that are used by writers, academics. There is Cathy used the term argue-speak, which is a term that we use to try to designate a particular kind of discourse. The template that Cathy read a moment ago: in recent discussions of blank, a controversial issue has been whether blank. On the one hand, some argue that blank, on the other, blah, blah, blah. Those are the conventional formulas of public, not just academics, but public policymakers, legal specialists, and professionals who communicate professionally in various areas. The discourse of climate science and climate debate, environmentalism, is couched in these kinds of intellectual formulas. And the reason why this point needs to be made, and why a textbook like ours needs to exist, is that students don't automatically acquire these particular formulas. Just what I just read, in recent discussions of blank, a controversial issue has been blank. Students don't grow up using that lingo. It would even sound pedantic, probably, and stilted in a lot of, among teenagers. Say, if you walked up and say, a controversial issue is, you'd be looked at and as probably strange. But once you get into school, it turns out to be, if you can't use a term like a controversial issue is, you're going to be at a disadvantage in school and in the public sphere beyond, arguing about climate change or whatever. So there's special kinds of formulas that our book is concentrating on.
And in my line of work, I first heard about you through Randy Olson, who he and I are great friends now. And of course, he's got the and button therefore template that I use. I found it hugely valuable in the branding world and helping people focus a theme and a message, this and this, but this, here's the complication, the conflict. Therefore, here's the answer to it. I have had people say it's reductive and insulting. And I go, well, it may appear that way, but it is extraordinarily powerful. And in fact, Randy just came out with his fourth book on the topic, Narrative is Everything. And it's the application of the ABT in the business world, politics, entertainment, religion. And I just had him on my show on show number 199. So for those of you that haven't heard that episode, it's a great follow-on after this show. But it brings me to this question, and I like, Cathy, I'll ask you, I don't know who came up with the title, but in your subhead here, I say, the moves that matter in academic writing. Why did you characterize these templates as moves?
Well, I think we're going back to something that's really central to our book. I think we touched on it a little bit earlier, that it doesn't just, we're trying not to simply explain in an abstract way what academic discourse, intellectual, professional discourse looks like, or argument looks like. We're trying to give students actual moves, the actual how-to. We wanted to emphasize a kind of how-to component, a kind of practice element, as opposed to theoretical element to the book. And I think that the use of the word moves there is an attempt to signal that these are practices, moves, repeatable moves that students can pick up, and hence our templates. So I think that's what we and the phrase that matter in academic discourse. We think these are the most important moves in academic discourse. If you can amass a lot of evidence, or you know a lot of information, or you're extremely well read on a given subject, it's not going to do you a lot of good unless you can do what we think matters most, to echo our title, which is to use that information or knowledge, put it to use in an argument. You might know a lot of facts about climate change, but if you can't summarize other people's views regarding those facts, or what you consider to be facts, and use those facts or what you see as facts in your own argument, it's not going to have any sort of social value.
I actually really like the term, the moves. I thought about it a little bit differently. I can see where you were saying these are actual to-dos that you can have happen. I read them kind of as the strategic jujitsu moves that you would use in formulating an argument to get people to see your way of thinking.
Yeah.
No, I think that's right.
Jiu-jitsu move is a nice.
Very nice.
You're using their energy kind of against them, but to also be able to build your own position in something.
The notion of moves enables us to start naming, and we do in the book. We name and characterize particular things that you're performing, actions you're performing, which we think is a useful thing for writers to be aware of. For example, I'm just looking at our table of contents, starting with what others are saying. This is the injunction that we begin with. Resist the temptation to start your essay with what you think, because the chances are, if you do that, people may understand what you're saying, but they won't know why you're saying it. You want to start with what others are saying, because when you do that, when you sketch what others are saying, you summarize what others are saying, then your readers can understand why then you're saying what you're saying.
Establish the context, I guess.
Well, a lot of people nowadays are confuse climate with the weather, but that's what they're saying. So now I have to explain that why that's a misunderstanding. Summarizing is a move. I'm just looking at our table of contents. The art of summarizing, the art of quoting, and then we have a chapter called 3 Ways to Respond. The I say, moving from the they say dimension or moment to the I say moment in your writing. we claimed that there were really fundamentally only three ways to respond to an argument, and we call it yes, no, okay, but. We can say, yes, I agree. We can say, no, I disagree. Or we can say, well, I partly agree, but, and this would be, here we're in Randy Olson's territory of and, but, therefore. Yes, I agree up to a point, but I have to insist that blah, blah, blah. And those are examples of moves. The notion of moves allows us to break down language into rhetorical patterns, but our names for them, we think, are maybe, we hope, we like to think they're more helpful than some of the fancier academic names for rhetorical patterns. We talk about planting a naysayer in your text, plant a skeptic, a person who, as Cathy was saying earlier, can say the worst possible imaginable thing about your own argument. Plant that in right up front, and that's a powerful rhetorical move. So anyway, that's another dimension of this
it's
idea.
The jujitsu of argument. You're making my argument for me. It really is, because you are being able to set that person up here. You are embracing what they're saying in their position, which is going to be opposed to yours, but you're getting that right up front.
Empowering it, yeah.
Yeah, you're empowering it.
Giving it power so that you can then set up your own agenda.
And again, this is really counterintuitive for most writers and speakers, because I think we tend to think, well, I'm going to make my argument here and I'm going to try and persuade people to adopt my viewpoint, but therefore I'm going to bury the counter view. I'm going to repress it. I'm going to minimize it and hope people don't notice it doesn't exist and just agree with my viewpoint. But we're saying no, in fact, bring that counter view. The worst thing that can be said, not just like an easy softball that can be said against your view that you can hit out of the park, really genuinely summarize the worst thing that can be said against you, the most hard-hitting critique that can be made of your view. And if you can't come up with a really good answer, maybe your own view, it's a kind of good writing test for coming up with a good speech or a good lecture or a good essay or a good book, a good argument, is to run it through the test of what's the worst thing that somebody could say against it. Really develop it as long as you can, not just in one sentence, but over long periods of time, and really develop it as much as you possibly can and see, can I fully refute it or do I need to change my own view?
Mm-hmm. And embracing it, though, don't you also take the energy away from it because you are acknowledging it in the room?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. It's a kind of a paradox that the best way to disarm an argument is to give it full voice. And I noticed that the more in my own writing, my own academic articles and books, that the more I went the extra mile to unpack as completely as I could the counter view to what I was to the view that I was taking, the less I got criticized. It was as if, since I had, it was like a preemptive strike. I had preemptively unpacked all the arguments that I could think of that could be made against me, and I had kind of left my my adversaries without any without their weapons. Or they could still come back, but it was harder for them to do it. The more you empower the opponent, the harder it is for them to come back against you.
One thing we've been recommending in this conversation is that writers and speakers begin with the counter view and then build their argument out from that. But it's not just a matter of front-loading the counter view and summarizing it at the outset of your text. It's also a matter of returning to that counter argument and that skepticism or that disbelief over and over again in your writing with phrases like, of course, at this point, skeptics will object that blah, blah, blah. Or, since I'm celebrating X, people who are critics of X will obviously want to respond here that I'm, idealizing or something. That you're going to want to continue. It's not just a matter of dispatching the counter view at the start of a text and then refuting it for the rest of your argument. You want to keep returning to that kind of dialogue with the other, with the opposing view, and give it as much airtime as you possibly can throughout the text. It's like a dialogue. Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail is a real classic example in which he just keeps on summarizing what people were saying against civil disobedience at the time. And he continually answers it. It's just a dialogue. It's like a play. He summarizes his critics, then King gives his answer. Then King summarizes the critics again, and then he gives his own answer. And that goes on just throughout. That's all the text is. It's just one big dialogue with his opponents.
So there's kind of an emotional basis behind this. You were referring earlier, Park, to the emotional underpinnings of communication that are often neglected. It's not just logical. That when you put yourself in the shoes of somebody else and summarize their perspective, even though it's challenging yours, you're making them feel understood, especially if you do it without caricaturing them, without trying to, there's parodic summaries that make the person being summarized look like a fool. But I know this in reading reviews of my work, or I think Cathy in my case, we've gotten a lot of reviews of our book, and we've gotten some hostile reviews. But when they summarize us accurately and fairly, I mean, you say, well, gee, that's great. It's you feel understood, even though the person summarizing you is ultimately rejecting your view. And that's a kind of emotional bond. I think that goes back to the kind of bonding that we're talking about, that we're more about bonding than winning. That there's nothing like a good summary, and it's rare, actually.
I think this is one reason why sometimes, I don't know if you found this, Park, but sometimes I've noticed in a very unscientific survey that that sometimes when I debate somebody or have an argument, a quote-unquote argument or debate with somebody with whom I greatly disagree about an issue, I can actually feel more connected to that person than sometimes sitting around just agreeing with a chum who tends to see things eye to eye with me. And sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes a debate or argument with somebody who disagrees with me can be very alienating and upsetting. But at times you can really feel like you're touching base with the other person and really feeling heard, even though you might not come away having established complete common ground and commonality. So it's not necessarily a matter of, again, we're trying to reconstruct, redefine what argument is as a matter of connecting with others rather than just trying to demolish them.
Yeah, I think this is one reason why in the world of sports, if you watch a lot of the shows, ESPN, and so they're all argument shows, and there's something that's deeply bonding about arguing about sports. That on the one hand, it's combative. You're trying to win the argument for why, I don't know, Javier Baez, Chicago, the Cubs player, is better than somebody else or something. I don't know. Pick your example. But there's something deeply bonding about the debate, even though it's contentious. And I think you could even say that about sports competition itself, which is deeply bonding, of course, because in some sense it's an unreal world. It's a made-up world of sports, and so there's less at stake in the argument than there is at stake, say, in a debate about the environment or about other race or poverty or something like that. Yeah. But I think we are trying to tap into the that element of bonding that operates in good debates.
Yeah. The last question I have for you on this that I thought was a really interesting and a surprising insight for me anyway, is I think maybe it was Cathy, you mentioned that in the book that understanding these templates actually makes you a better reader. a better consumer of information. And I was wondering if you can elaborate on that. Why is that? Why does that work that way in our minds?
Well, yeah, I think the premise that we have a chapter on reading for the conversation, using the templates to make yourself a better reader. Our premise is that understanding what you read is a matter of identifying moves in the reading, templates, being able to say, oh, what this author is now planning a naysayer, or this author is using a yes but move, or is using a meta commentary. We have a chapter on that, stepping outside your text in order to say what you're not doing in the text, rather than what people, the common moves good writers do is saying, now, you might think that what I'm doing here is attacking so-and-so, but that's not my point at all. I'm not attacking so-and-so. I'm saying that so-and-so is really good, but needs to be doing this as well, or something like that. Once you can identify the standard moves in arguments and in communication, you can identify those moves more quickly, and you understand what you're reading better.
I think this is really important, just to add one more comment to this notion of how the templates are useful for reading. Just taking the very title of our textbook, They Say, I Say, and going with that, there's a kind of common sense view when you read something on a page by author Jane Smith, that all the words that Jane Smith wrote in her text, or that she says in her speech, for instance, are Jane Smith's. When in fact, Jane Smith spends a lot of time, if she's like most effective writers, and if she's an effective writer, we think, a persuasive writer, she'll spend a lot of time summarizing other people's views she actually hates. And our students, not recognizing that, will come away with really cuckoo, it's understandable, misunderstandings of what a text says. For instance, if they read the letter from Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King, and they aren't on the alert for the they say voice versus the I say voice of Jane Smith, they might assume that Martin Luther King was himself attacking civil disobedience because it says so right there on the page, rather than ventriloquizing like a puppet the voice of the counter view, the anti-civil disobedience position, in order to critique that position and come out in favor of civil disobedience. We've had students come away from a Karl Marx or an Adam Smith document thinking that Adam Smith is much like a critic of an opponent of free market capitalism, even though what Adam Smith was doing in a given passage that the student misunderstood was actually summarizing a counter view that he disagreed with. So just being alert for different voices in a text, that they aren't all emanating from the authentic soul of the author, they're very important for students to understand as readers, and anybody as a reader.
And again, I guess that brings the whole conversation style into this. You're having a dialogue versus just stating a point, trying to get across your expert opinion by bringing in these other voices, by bringing in the opposition, and then refuting them in your own way. You really have a they say, I say. You have, I guess, right down to the dialectic, right? You got a thesis, antithesis, and the synthesis coming together.
Absolutely.
Fascinating. Really, really fascinating. Thank you so much for being here. What could each of you share one tip that you think our listeners should do right after listening to this as they go out to do their very first their very next communication piece?
I have a tip. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that it's been talked about, much discussed in the past 5 years, especially in society, that we really tend to sequester ourselves from people who disagree with us and sequester ourselves in silos and all that. And I think, we run away from disagreement. We run away from debate. And if that's true, as I think it is, I would really encourage people to try and reconfigure the way they look at disagreement, not as something that's necessarily going to destroy relationships and destroy connections with people, but as something that is an opportunity to try and understand and listen to the other side more, this is very hard when you disagree with something, to actually sit on your hands and stifle what you yourself want to say for a while and genuinely listen to what the other person is saying with a real open mind and try and walk around in their shoes. But if you take that one piece of advice, it's a nice way of diffusing the negatives of debate and difference and disagreement, and trying to turn it into a learning opportunity and a way of we're always going to want to get across our viewpoint. We can't just go around repressing them with people, even if people who live in the same silo as us, the same general blue state, red state. We're still going to have disagreements, and we still have to have models and practice at engaging in effective disagreement rather than destructive disagreement, if that's possible.
So, Cathy, using one of your templates, on one hand, I completely agree with you. We have to get out of the echo chamber and get out and have an appreciation for other people's stance. On the other hand, it's really difficult in this day and age of the age of rage. People just seem like they have lost the nuance of conversation and dialogue, and they are so quick to be triggered and say, how could you possibly oppress me this way? And dialogue falls apart.
We all have the righteous mind, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a habit. It's a habit. That's one reason why we use the term moves, is to suggest habits, habitual moves, that once you get in the habit of this, you can be a calming force in debates and arguments that often do get heated, and they're going to, but you can come back the next time and say, I've been thinking about what you said, and I think what you're trying to say, and I'm not necessarily saying I agree with it, but what I really heard you saying is that you're concerned about blank, and that you're concerned blah, blah, blah is going to happen. That's not my concern, but I really hear that you're concerned about that, and I can respect it, and I can see your viewpoint. And, you can come back and come back if a debate is alienating the first round, come back and try and connect better the second time around, or the third or fourth. Might take a while. Nobody's going to come out of the gate succeeding all the time with this method. No. And sometimes you don't want to succeed. Sometimes you do want an alienating conversation. Sometimes you do want to. It's just the way it's got to be.
Yep. Jerry, do you have a tip for our listeners?
Well, yeah, and just an extension of what Cathy said. Sit down and force yourself to summarize a belief that you not only disagree with, but find maddening or contemptible or hateful. Just try to summarize it. Try to imagine what it would be like to actually be inside this belief, to believe it. There's an academic writer we quote, Peter Elbow, who calls it the believing game. He says that writers need to practice playing the believing game when they summarize views that they don't hold or disagree with. Instead of just immediately jumping to the contrary and saying, well, that's ridiculous, that's contemptible, try to imagine how somebody could actually believe this and what it would feel like to live inside that belief. That doesn't mean you have to end up embracing it, but it's great therapy for culture in which we're so quick, to immediately wall ourselves off from people who disagree with us.
Well, Jerry and Cathy, thank you so much for being here on the show today. I mean, it's just fascinating. I love your book. Where can people get your book? And I think you also have a website that they can go and follow you and more of your readings and writing, right?
Well, it's published by W.W. Norton. So if you go to the W.W. Norton website, you'll find a lot of you'll find about how to order the book. You can buy it at Barnes & Noble and other bookstores, but it might be hard to get it there. It's easier to order it. If you Google our names, Graff and Birkenstein, there's a lot of stuff about our book and about how to get it. And Amazon is also a good source for getting a copy. And another an advantage of our book, we like to think, is that it's short and it's therefore relatively cheap.
Well, it's short, it's powerful. You also have a lot of example writings in it that I found really, really helpful. because you can see these
Uh-huh.
moves in play from all kinds of writers. And I imagine a lot of these writers aren't maybe even aware of those moves. It's not like they've written, from your book. They're just really good communicators. But what we're asking people to be, as I do with storytelling, is become intentional, learn the frameworks and intentionally use that. You don't have to rely so much on your innate abilities, which can sometimes let you down. So that's what I feel like your book does such a brilliant job of giving us those intentional templates so that we can make our arguments stand that much stronger. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Park.
And I'd like to thank you all for listening to this edition of The Business of Story. If you liked what you heard today, number one, get the book. And number two, share this episode with a friend, a family, colleague member, someone who is working through a communications challenge or opportunity. These templates work. 2 million books sold and counting tells you these templates work. So put them into your arsenal and make the most of them. And of course, if I can be of service to you, visit me at Business of Story, where I have 3 primary templates that you can use in your brand and business storytelling. Plus, I have a whole host of talents, tips, and techniques there just waiting for you to be able to craft and tell compelling stories that sell. So thank you for listening, and I can't wait for you to join us again next Monday when we will have another amazing story artist on with us right here at Business of Story. And until then, remember that the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thanks for listening.